Yes, I
So
can
I'd
hear you.
like to welcome, okay, great. So I'd like to welcome you to my presentation titled So Much Data, So Little Time, Prioritizing Manuscript Collections for ArchivesSpace. At the Watkinson, I serve as the Special Projects Associate at the Watkinson Library, also called Watkinson Library for Special Collections and College Archives at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. So if you could please turn to the next slide. This presentation will focus on a little bit about the background of manuscripts and college archives and the database project and the legacy finding aids, formats, and early decisions that we made, as well as the prioritization and selection criteria and process we went through for this project. And if you could turn to the background slide. Thank you very much, Madeline, for doing this, by the way. So the manuscripts in college archives contain approximately 40,000 linear feet of material, including manuscripts spanning the 17th through the 20th centuries, dealing with various subjects such as indigenous languages in North America, 19th century education reform, colonial medicine, and 20th century civil rights activism. We also hold 25,000 pieces of sheet music, some from very notable local composer named Nathan Allen, thousands of feet of ephemera ranging from postcards to broadsides related to Hartford and surrounding areas, several thousand ornithological slides and photographic materials from the 19th through the 20th centuries, and many from the prominent ornithologist Francis Cope, as well as, so just to get a little bit into the project, we focused on adding collection finding aids from library manuscripts, a large group of collections consisting of personal papers from prominent 19th and early 20th century Hartford area intellectuals, artists and naturalists, as well as members of David Watkinson's family and Watkinson himself, who played a key role in founding the college library and was a trustee. Our workforce was fairly small. It consisted of me entering data and doing reworking of the finding aids, as well as a regular student worker assisting with reprocessing and making container lists. We utilized Google Documents and Sheets to rewrite documents to maximize sharing and collaboration. If you could turn to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we have legacy finding aids in a variety of formats, ranging from card catalogs to HTML pages in Trinity's digital repository. Several pilot finding aids that had already been uploaded into the system. But other than that, the vast majority were in these formats, and some were in Word documents on a shared drive. So some early on decisions were made to rewrite 45 plus finding aids to reflect DACs, describing archives a content standard minimum or optimal requirements, include file level description and container lists for collections of manuscripts, ephemera, and visual materials, such as slides and photographs, and enhance access to some collections physically processed at more minimal levels using MPLP, or not in conformance to standards and best practices utilized in the profession. So some further processing and reprocessing was being added along the way as we did data entry. And I should add that the vast majority of these collections were not digital collections. There's only one digitized collection, the Cope family papers, or the Cope papers. So if you could change to the next slide, please. Thank you. So our prioritization and selection criteria, we determined which collections to prioritize for data entry rewriting based upon the following criteria. Was it frequently used in the past 1 to 2 years? We use spreadsheets to track this data, as many libraries do, so we went and looked through that information. Was it a historically significant collection for the history of the Watkinson, like the Watkinson family papers? Was it in high demand from professors and outside researchers who could not easily be able to access the finding aids through another or in another format? So if they were in a card catalog format, that wouldn't be very easy for someone on the outside to access without coming in. And then the format of the current finding aid, would it be easy to take some of the data from that finding aid and reuse it? And then the current accessibility and degree of reprocessing needed for the whole collection, the whole physical collection, was also a factor that we considered. So if you could go to the next slide. Thanks. Some steps taken in the process were to evaluate the collection use data on manuscripts, as I mentioned, co-locate formats of legacy finding aids and accompanying materials, including deeds of gift, donor information, and other files useful for enriching description when we went back and rewrote. I'm looking ahead to see which classes were coming in and what professors wanted to use, what was in demand, either subject-wise or for specific collections. We also evaluated the condition of the collections, what condition were the materials in physically, did they need preservation, and whether further processing would be required in terms of description and arrangement. So that's all for my talk. I went kind of speedily through. If you could turn to the last slide, you can feel free to contact me, my information, or ask me questions later. I'd be happy to talk more about what we did and how the process kind of changed as we worked on it and priorities shifted. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right, so, and again, if you could hold your questions until the end, and I believe I stopped sharing. So if we could have the next presenter, Sarit, if you want to go ahead and open up your screen. Thank you. All right. Okay, so next up we have Sarit Hand and Francesca Pitaro from the AP Corporate Archives, and I'll let y'all start whenever you're ready.
Can you hear us?
No, I cannot hear you. So if you were talking, I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry about that. We're having some difficulty here.
It's okay. No worries.
Okay. I think we're ready.
Perfect. Excellent.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Francesca Pitaro, archivist at the AP Corporate Archives in New York, and this is my colleague, Sarit Hand. I'm the digital archivist. And our presentation today is Where Did I Put That? Using Locations in ArchivesSpace. The AP is an international cooperative news organization founded in 1846. We have staffers in more than 250 locations in 100 countries, with our main headquarters in New York. The Corporate Archives was founded in 2003 to document the history of the AP and its operations. You can see a brief overview of our holdings on the screen. So we collect paper records, books, artifacts, the whole range. We've been using ArchivesSpace, hosted by lyricists, to manage our collections since 2014 when we migrated from the Archivist Toolkit. We have a staff of 3, including Sarit, myself, and the Archives Director. Because we currently have 350 resource records with 2,800 associated containers already entered in ArchivesSpace, our project to test out the location feature is a retrospective one. We focused our project on our on-site storage, which currently houses 100 collections occupying 1,200 linear feet of shelf space. That's about a third of our total holdings, with the rest of the collections being stored off-site in a separate location. Here's a quick overview of what we will cover today. We will actually demonstrate creating locations, linking containers, cover a few things that you may want to consider, and the pros and cons for our organizational purposes. We recently began a shelf reading and decided to test ArchivesSpace locations feature. For a start, we created a locations listing at the shelf level. Using a concatenation formula, I was able to create a unique string based on the shelf number for each bay in each row, as seen in the left image in the column called classification. This also enabled us to print labels along with having a quick reference number for each shelf. Fast forward, you can see on the right how the data in the spreadsheet translated into ArchivesSpace. However, we could not import the CSV directly into ArchivesSpace. We do not host our own tenancy and therefore do not have access to the backend to use an API or other means. So we use the create bulk locations option built into ArchivesSpace instead. In this video, you will see how we created our bulk locations. Starting from our home screen, we click create, and hover over location to open a secondary menu and create bulk locations. This first segment in the form is the top level data for the range of locations. The next section is coordinate ranges. These are the parameters needed for the system to create the bulk locations. For us, the first coordinate is row, and we have 14 rows. The second is bay, and each row has 6 bays. The third coordinate is shelf, and each bay has 7 shelves. Selecting the preview button allows us to review the data before generating the locations. The list appears, and you can see here the building information and the range for each identified location. There are 7 shelves for each bay and 6 bays for each row, giving us our total of 588 locations. After scrolling through the whole list, you can click Continue to return to the form, and you can either make changes or click the blue Create Location button to generate new records for each location, which may take a moment. Once the system generates the records, you can see they will appear, and you can filter down to what you just created. You can sort the locations so they appear in order according to the ranges. If you click on View, you can open up the record for a single location, and if you desire to, you can make changes. Clicking Edit opens the form, and you can see a few extra fields if you want to explore. There are barcode and classification fields which we could not bulk enter, and in order to use this option, we will have to enter each one manually. After all said and done, our on-site archives room contains 588 individual locations, or in this case, shelves. Now we are ready to link top containers to their locations. Once all the locations were loaded into ArchivesSpace, we began to link top containers to locations. The first step is to select Manage Top Containers from the Gear drop-down menu, which you can see in the image on the left. On the right, you see the interface that allows you to search for top containers. There are several ways to do this. We opted to search by resource records so that we could pull up all the containers connected to a single collection and then link them to their locations. On the left are the results of the search, a list of the containers for this collection. Clicking at the top of the indicator column will sort the containers in numerical order, making it easier to find and select the containers you want to work with. You can then click on the containers you want to link to a location. Here I've selected all the boxes for a single shelf location. Once the containers are highlighted, You go to the Bulk Operations menu and select Update Locations, Single Location to add a single location to multiple containers. Next, you search the locations to find the correct one for the containers. That's the image on the bottom left. And this is where having a unique ID for each shelf comes in handy. You can see that each location starts with Liberty 20, Archives, etc., and we have 588 to choose from. Using the unique ID, I can easily enter the exact shelf location, LA 010605, and bring it up quickly without having to sift through them all. I'm adding locations to all the boxes on a single shelf at once. This is efficient for us because 99% of our collections are stored in box number order on contiguous shelves. Finally, once you selected the correct location, hit the blue Update button to save your changes. Once your data is in ASpace, there are several ways you can access the information. One is through the resource record, where you can view a location for one individual container at a time. You do this by opening the container instance record and then viewing that container. The process is time-consuming and cumbersome, but it gets you to the location information.
Another way to look at locations is to return to the Manage Top Containers screen. If filtering by resource record, the top containers of that collection will appear with their locations. This is also a good place to go if you need to make any changes to the top containers, including updating the location for a specific container or a range of containers. Finally, there is exporting. Under Browse Locations, there is an export option, but there is no way to filter that I've found. It is a complete list in CSV format. Several reports are made available in the Reports section of ArchivesSpace and can be exported into several formats. Here you can see we generated a resource and location CSV as an example. So a couple of things we discovered. In our repository, we have always tracked locations at the collection level in a spreadsheet. An ArchivesSpace location is linked to individual container instant records, not to a resource or archival object. When Accession Records and Toolkit, which had locations attached, migrated into ArchivesSpace, false top containers called items were generated and then linked to a location record. We are working with Lyrasis to clear out the false data. Doing this again, we might have used a different numbering method so we could incorporate unique ID and create both location records without having to enter in a classification code manually.
And finally, we've noted a few pros and cons for us in our repository. So creating bulk locations was relatively quick and easy, and the enhanced physical control of the collection makes it easier to track boxes for security purposes. On the con side, it's a big project, and a lot of staff time would be needed to update our existing container records. So far, we've added locations for 200 of the 2,800 containers we have in ArchivesSpace. We also have an additional 2,000 containers that do not have individual top container instances in ArchivesSpace. And as Sarit mentioned, because location isn't directly associated with the resource record, you can't really see the location for a collection at the resource record level. So we have to change our focus of how to find collections.
And that concludes our presentation where we can find our stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We'll be happy to answer any questions or contact us via email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarit, Francesca. I really appreciate it. Okay, so you can go ahead, and stop sharing your screen whenever you get a second. So we have one more presentation. Okay, so Kevin Schlottmann and David Hodges from Columbia University. If you wanted to go ahead and start sharing your slides.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Sure, I can hear you.
Okay. Let's see if this will work.
Okay, great. I can see your slides now.
Okay, our slides are up.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And Kevin and I are actually joining from different locations. So Kevin, are you on?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm David Hodges. I'm a special collections analyst at Columbia University Libraries, and I'm joined there with, on the other line with Kevin Schlottmann, the head of archives processing. We just want to talk a little bit about our experiences of migrating ArchivesSpace. We're in the midst of a three-phase migration process. We started a process in 2017. It was initiated as a multi-phase project to migrate the archival data from several repositories and from different formats into ArchivesSpace. We chose to go with Lyricist to host ArchivesSpace rather than self-hosting. And in order to, one of the goals that we'll discuss was that we were aiming to preserve some continuity over this process, so we spread out the migration into 3 phases. The first phase, which took about a half a year to complete, involves migrating the collection level data only, the MARC records plus accessions, leaving finding aids in legacy systems. And CUL, Columbia shifted to using the staff interface plus the OAI feed to feed into our publishing platform, but we did not yet adopt the PUI. In phase 2, which we are currently in the midst of, consists of migrating the EADs into ArchivesSpace. There's about 1,400 legacy finding aids in EAD format, which we are in the process of migrating now and merging with the MARC data, and we'll touch on that in a later slide. And then phase 3, which would be coming this fall or winter, would be to adopt the PUI or some comparable interface for publication. So, and I'll hand off to Kevin to talk.
Thanks, David. So just a little bit about the background of our data universe. Columbia has multiple repositories that have been collecting archival materials for nearly 100 years. And since the mid-1990s, there have been multiple projects to put description online of some sort, starting with a mass scanning of PDFs, of paper finding aids, doing some custom HTML. We were also fairly early adopters of EAD back before many of the current tools and approaches were available. So we have a fairly complex homegrown system that we use to publish and maintain EAD. We also needed and still do need MARC records to allow archival description to appear in our library catalog and thus in our discovery layer, because the EADs were never integrated into the discovery layer. Key to the problems that we had is that the MARC and the EAD were created at the same time, but did not interact once they went into their separate systems. So the data diverged very quickly over the last 10 or so years. As you can imagine, this leads to a very diverse set of records and data before us as we're trying to work through this. For example, one thing that we discovered is we actually still had MARC records in the MARC AMC format, where we would have the type of material in a 245 sub K and the creator being pulled out of the 100 sub A. Those, when we imported those, end up with a whole bunch of resource records that just said manuscripts or papers. And that's when we discovered that we had those and had to clean those up. There's all sorts of stuff going on in the EAD, ranging from display hacks, putting in empty tags or extra empty tags to make things display in a certain way. And we also have, we had fairly limited nesting capabilities built into our schema. And so what happened over time was that we needed to actually use a lot of different nesting, including things like lots of file inside file. So we are discovering that now as we were preparing the data for our migration. And David, could you hit the slide for me? Thank you. So given this universe, ArchivesSpace offered us many advantages and improvements. Really the big one was that we wanted one single source of truth for archival metadata. No more multiple records with manual updates required for each. So our phasing was such that in phase 1, we pushed in our collection level records, and at that point, archivists now edit top level description in ArchivesSpace, and that gets pushed out to the catalog and then to the discovery layer. As David mentioned, we are in the midst of phase 2. Once phase 2 is completed, an archivist will edit either top level or DSC level archival description, and it will be automatically pushed to the catalog and the discovery layer and to the EAD publication platform. So at that point, an archivist will have to touch one system and it can get pushed out in a couple of different directions. This means no more XML editing Oxygen, no more editing MARC records in the Voyager client, and much easier lives for all of the archivists working on materials at Columbia. This builds us the base for phase 3, which is going to be improvement, focus on improved UX for users, both staff and researchers. The public display of our findings hasn't been updated in about 10 years, and so it is definitely time for us to do that. And by doing this, this data migration first and being really aware of what the data is, I think we're well set up to make some good UX choices going forward. With that, I'm going to throw it back to David to talk about some of the specific tooling that we built in phase 2 that I think is pretty neat.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so the main task of phase 2, again, was to merge the component descriptions in the legacy EADs with the collection level data that was already in ArchivesSpace and in our catalog, and import it all into ArchivesSpace and make sure we can publish it back out in the expected way. We had to develop a number of tools and processes, but I want to zoom in on one in particular for this presentation. There's a challenge that we faced, which was that the collection level data often differed between the two data sources. Abstracts, access restrictions, BioHist, and some other of these descriptive elements had been managed independently with varying workflows, and there was no simple rule to determine the version of record in all cases. Sometimes the finding aid was right, sometimes the MARC. We needed an efficient way to compare the two, or have archivists compare the two, element by element, record by record, and make determinations of what to keep or discard, and to also not spend years doing this, as we have a large amount of data. So you see here an example of one record, an outline of the discrepancies between the legacy on the left and what was imported from our MARC records into ArchivesSpace in the middle, and the desired output on the right. So we delved into existing tools and wound up creating some of our own tooling for this process. We've made heavy use of Python scripting, Google Sheets, and XSLT. We developed a tool in particular to scan the EADs from the two sources, the legacy finding aids and the ArchivesSpace output, pull the same set of elements from each, and place their contents side by side for review by archivists. For this, we made use of the Google Sheets API to interact with shared documents in an automated way, in effect using Google Sheets both as a lightweight database and as a flexible QA tool. Using a defined list of XPath expressions, data is pulled from the two related EADs and pushed to prepared tabs in the Google Sheet. And now the queries and filters in the Google Sheet then organize each targeted element for side-by-side comparison, legacy versus ArchivesSpace. This is an example of one comparison tab that an archivist would look at for a series of records. And again, this is all automated, pushed to the sheet by a Python script. The archivist can scroll through the record and flag content to migrate for each record. And then the data is filtered into a scorecard-like grid as shown here. So this will show the collection level elements to migrate for each record in a grid format. Okay, then back in Python, another script looks at this grid, again using the Google API, and reads the flagged elements for each record as a list object. The list items are turned into parameters for each record and then passed in turn to an XSLT process. The style sheet in the XSLT style sheet merges data from the two EAD sources, incorporating the selected collection level elements as well as the DSC into a new result document, ready to be imported into ArchivesSpace. There's some additional XSLT cleanup that happens, and we do some, some basic QA and validation before importing into ArchivesSpace. So this is what we're in the middle of right now. We've been developing this tool as part of our workflow and along with a number of other tools. And we're putting everything in our repo as we go along. We'll probably be adding more things as we go, and we'd appreciate any and all feedback from anyone who's facing similar problems, or have been looking at similar approaches or different approaches. We would be very interested in communicating with other folks in the midst of migration. And thank you all.
Okay, well, thanks so much to Kevin and David. If you want to stop sharing your screen, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. And for the rest of the participants, if you do have questions, now is the time for questions. Actually, let me, I'll turn on my video so you can have something to look at in the meantime. Okay, so while you, are typing your questions, there were a couple, of questions that came up, that I do want to get to. Okay, so the first one was, are there any ArchivesSpace support groups, in Philadelphia, or, in the area of Philadelphia? And thanks to Laura Woodford, she found a group called the Mid-Atlantic ArchivesSpace Pinterest group. So, if you Google that, it should bring you up a Google group. Full disclosure, not sure, if it's still active or working, but that might be an option for you. Okay. Secondly, someone asked, about the presentation, and if they would be shared. So we've had a couple, of presenters share their slides. We're still waiting on some, but when, all of them are up, they will be, in the ArchivesSpace, online forum wiki. Okay, thank you. So, all right, so we have some questions coming in. I'm going to read those out, so give me just a moment. Okay, so this is for Columbia. What do you do, if anything, with MARC subject headings and person headings? Did you attempt to get these from MARC into ArchivesSpace?
So this is Kevin at Columbia. Yes, so in phase one, we did do that. One of the reasons we chose to use MARC records rather than EADs is because the MARC records had been undergoing authority control continuously as part of the larger universe MARC records in our Voyager catalogs. We did notice that the import of agent records is less than perfect, kind of out of the box. I actually talked about this quite a bit at the at last August's AS Day forum, where I talked about the beginnings of authority control. My colleagues at Yale actually have done a whole lot more work around this than we have, but essentially what we did is we did a whole bunch of duping because we found that creators, when creators were found in a 1XX field and also found in a 6XX field, there were duplicate records created, once as a creator and once as a subject. So we did some duping, and we also put in a whole bunch of authority control links that we're able to get in automated fashion from LC, and then we use the API to pump those in. So there's still a fair amount of cleanup to do, but we've kind of did the first pass, sufficient that that data is now being pushed back into our catalog. There was definitely some weirdness when we first started doing that, but overall that process has actually gone pretty well. And I see in the comments here that Ruth mentions she's going to be presenting on MARC subjects to ASpace later today at the beginning of Block C, and I'm sure she'll have interesting things to say about that as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. And someone else had commented, and thank you for doing this, that the Mid-Atlantic group looked like the last post was in 2017, so it might not be active. Anyway, I appreciate that comment. Thank you. All right. Let's see. All right. So let's see. Hold on. Let me read this really quickly. Okay. So North Dakota State University says, our archives sometimes have multiple, identifiers per resource, and this was done due to shifting issues in the past. And from what they've been told, this may be, a present issue with locations. When you were updating locations, did you run into any issues with connecting an identifier to a location, or are locations only linked to top containers and not identifiers? I believe that question is for AP corporate archives. If I'm, incorrect, let me know. If that was for someone else.
Hello?
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So basically that was one of the points that we wanted to address, or we addressed, was the fact that locations is not connected to a resource record. It's connected to the top container. So you have to connect then the top container as an instance, or create an instance top container in the resource record or archival record. So you look at your record and you create an instance and a container. You have to go into the container record, and that's what's connected to the location. That's why it's a little bit cumbersome trying to find a listing of locations for one collection. And that's where we went into the managed top containers, did the filter on the collection we wanted, and that's where you see the listing of containers and then the locations in one list. Does that answer your question? Great.
Thank you. And Sarit, if you could just stay on, because I have a question for you. For those that are new to ArchivesSpace, aren't familiar with the terminology, can you talk about what container means, in the context of ArchivesSpace?
Well, from my understanding, a container represents the physical thing that your asset is in. So it may be a box, it may be, it can be almost anything. There is a controlled value list that you can create for this, or it comes already pre-populated. But let's say just on a very basic level, it's the physical box. It represents that physical box that your folders may be in. And then you can have children containers, a child container under there that may be your folder. Depending on how you have your collections and hierarchy arranged in ArchivesSpace may depend upon how you will break this out. It really, it's almost like you got to have to map it in advance so that you have consistency, at least by collection. If different collections are processed differently, then you may adjust accordingly. So that box is represented by an instance. Under instances, you can either do a digital instance, as we know, or a container instance. So if you have described, let's say at a series level, and that series has 10 boxes, then you might, in that archival object for the series, or if it's a resource record, create 10 instances called containers, and they can be a box, a folder, in a drawer someplace, depending on just what you consider a container.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay, so Stephanie asks, is there a plan to change this in ArchivesSpace? Okay, so for locations, to be linked to resources. And I think that's a question for Christine, perhaps.
Yeah, I can, this is Christine. I can chime in on that. So I would say there's not really a plan to change that at this time. I think that was a conscious decision to make it that way. But ArchivesSpace, the development of ArchivesSpace is directed by the community. So if there were a groundswell of community support for changing that model, that's potentially something that could be considered, but I would say that's not under active consideration at this time.
That's great. Thanks, Christine. All right, are there any more questions for the presenters? I'll let y'all think about that. I do have a question for Michelle. And so, if you're still listening, can you talk about, any lessons learned or, anything that you wish you had known before you started using ArchivesSpace, or implementing ArchivesSpace? That may have put you on the spot, and I understand if that's the case. Oh, and you know what? I think she might have left. Is she still there?
I think I just unmuted her, so I think she'll be okay now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, there definitely were lessons learned. I think the primary lesson that I learned was how long it took to get things done. There was only me, and like I said, there was another student working on it. So thinking of ways to try to get as much done as possible and being efficient in the process. And then throughout, I was kind of rethinking how we were prioritizing collections as we were going along. So I guess those are some of my lessons that I learned. Some of my key takeaways were that learning to be flexible, learning to be willing to make changes as the process went along, and documenting those changes like we should be doing as archivists. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to highlight, something you said. Okay, so documenting, your processes, anything that went wrong. I think that is really, really important. And I would encourage the community, if y'all are doing that, to share those resources with one another, because I think that would be really helpful. So and we have another question in the chat box, and this is for any of the presenters that spoke so far, and the question is, let's see, has anyone run into issues with over allocating space? Okay, so for example, the total for container profiles assigned to a shelf is greater than the location profile for that shelf. And Kevin has chimed in and said that they haven't done locations in space yet, so they won't be chiming in. But I don't know if AP Archives or Watkinson or anyone else wants to chime in, then let me know.
I wonder, is that a theoretical, or is that or is that something where you're actually trying to get additional containers on a shelf that don't fit? I just wonder, because I think one of the things in ArchivesSpace is you can change things. There's very few things that are set in stone. So you certainly can change things if you find that you sort of misestimated what the size of something is. But I'm wondering if this is a theoretical or real or something that's actually happened.
It's a real experience they've had.
Real experience, okay. Yeah.
Well, so we can take that question down, I guess, and Christine, what would you like to do with that question?
Yeah, sure. And Rebecca, if it's a case of the math is wrong, we'd definitely be very interested in hearing that. So certainly feel free to reach out to us. But if it's more sort of a colleague question, yeah, this might be an interesting thing to carry throughout the day to see if other people have experienced that.
And it looks like we have a comment from AP Archives. They haven't used the space feature, but we have started to use the profiles, to see what that does for them. And by using the profiles, there is a way to calculate extent. So I just wanted to put that up there. Okay. Okay, so another question is, I have a question about the linear inches extent. They can't get it to calculate the footage, only inches. Christine, do you have?
Yes, I believe right now that is a limitation of that it doesn't take that second step on the math. So that might be a feature request to just not very complicated math, obviously, to divide the inches by 12. But yes, I believe right now that is a limitation of the calculator. So you could certainly file a feature request, and Anne-Marie and Madeline put wonderful resources in there, including pointing to how to file a feature request. So I definitely encourage you to do that.
Thanks, Christine. And this next question might be for you as well. So for someone, who's just starting out with locations for, unprocessed collection boxes, would using barcodes expedite the process or slow it down, in your opinion?
I think Anne-Marie might, and maybe others who were in the lightning round might have some things to say about that.
Okay, great.
I would say in general, using barcodes is only helpful and expedites things if there's something you're going to use otherwise. But there definitely may be reasons if you're sort of on the fence about whether you would use them or not that might tip you one direction or the other. Or there may also be other people on the call who aren't necessarily speakers but have also had that experience and have made the decision one way or the other.
Okay. Well, I'm not getting any more comments. I'm not sure if anyone's going to, either from the presenters or from the audience at large is going to chime in. Let me see if there was anything that I missed there. I don't see any more questions coming in. Christine, how much more time do we have? Just want to make sure.
I believe you have 9 minutes. So,
okay.
So if there are questions or comments, definitely people should use those minutes, but you don't have to use those minutes.
Okay. Let's see here. If there's anything else coming in. I actually have a question for Anne-Marie. And I know you work a lot with, your own clients that you host, onboarding, and you talked about some documentation, some processes that you help them work through. Is there anything that you can think of, like common issues that come up with your clients, things they hadn't considered or things that they, didn't think about to consider, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think the biggest things come up with legacy data. So we'll work with customers on doing formal migrations, and some will choose not to for whatever reasons. And I haven't seen commonalities yet, but different things will come up with, like, well, how do we get this legacy data in? How are we going to do that? And I'll put another plug for that Harvard ArchivesSpace Excel import plugin, because it is just really, really great. It has really helped a lot of people be able to get their data in, because they can at least get it into the CSV files, if nothing else. It's just challenging. I'd say that's the commonality, legacy data, unless, unless you do a formal migration. Like our developer will write scripts depending on where the data is coming from, if it's in Excel spreadsheets, if it's in Archon or Archivist Toolkit or some other homegrown system. But if they decide not to go that way and kind of do their own legacy data from scratch, it's just a very daunting process. And it's a lot of work, and I think that's the commonality so far that I know of.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. I will say that, a common question that we get, for here at Lyrasis is, our clients don't know where to start, like how, I have this new software, but, I haven't really thought about, like a workflow or, like a process that will, to get started. So, I just wanted to reiterate the part, of your presentation about thinking about a plan, thinking about what you're doing locally, already, if you have any documented policies that you have in place, and then taking a look at ArchivesSpace, and thinking about how those might match up or align, because that will come in handy in the future. All right, so I have another comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to say something else?
Yeah, you just gave me an idea for people who don't do legacy data import at all, where they're coming into ArchivesSpace fresh, starting from scratch. They'll typically go with what's most frequently used. That's what they'll decide to put into ArchivesSpace first. That is something I have seen across the board. So whatever resources are used most often.
That's great, and thanks for saying that. I think that's, that's helpful to think about, what to prioritize over what to, add later. So that's great. Thank you. If anyone else thinks, of useful tips or lessons learned, that would be helpful to, to the rest, feel free to chime in, because I think that would be good to bring forward. I thought I heard someone, but maybe not. Maybe that was just my ears. I saw a couple more comments in the chat, so I want to get to those. Let me see. Okay, so Noah Huffman said, regarding the inches versus the feet, I believe you can set the default to feet in the configuration file. Let's see. There's a helpful post about this on the listserv. Noah, if you could find that link, that would be helpful, because maybe we can share that out. And Kevin said there, is also some good literature, about migration in Code for Lib, and JCAS. And let's see, Paul Woodford said, yes, I believe this setting an app config should change you from inches to feet, and she included a link, so thank you for doing that. And a question we have, is it possible to use metrics, centimeters, for UK users? Are you talking about for the locations, or I'm sorry, what are you talking about, Natalie? I just want to confirm. Locations. So for locations, is it possible to use meters or centimeters? And actually, I don't know that. Does anybody else know that?
Laura, if you look in the chat, Laura's got a great answer for that.
She does? Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm so sorry. So we're getting a lot of comments now, so I'm just falling behind on them, but thank you. Okay. Okay, so Laura had said, yes, available units are feet, inches, meters, and centimeters. Okay, so thanks, Laura, for chiming in. I appreciate it. And Kevin had said JCAS stands for Journal of Contemporary archival studies. Okay, so thank you for putting that in there as well. And I'm trying not to miss these questions, so give me just a second. Let's see, and Sarit had asked, if we host with lyricists, would they make that change? I would contact the tech team, at Lyricist and see if they can do that for you. Okay, and I believe that's everything